Last March, 235 Americans boarded the Costa Luminosa cruise ship headed for Europe. They left Fort Lauderdale on March 5th. At that time, there were only about 200 confirmed cases of coronavirus in the United States. But as they were crossing the Atlantic, word spread that 3 passengers who left the ship during port calls in the Caribbean tested positive for COVID, and 1 had died. This is the story of what happened next. A flight back home that had all the ingredients of a super spreading event, and how the agency tasked with controlling such outbreaks, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, knew about it and did not stop it.
The story will continue in a moment.
By the time the Costa Luminosa was halfway across the Atlantic, passengers we spoke to say it seemed like everyone was coughing. It was supposed to be a 20-day cruise from Florida to Italy. Bob and Sue Anderson were traveling to visit family in Europe. Those early days in March, COVID was starting, but you made a decision that you were going to go on a cruise.
We wanted to travel to see our granddaughter. We didn't really worry about it.
And it wasn't until we got on the ship and 2 or 3 days into the cruise where everything then blew up.
At what point did you start feeling sick?
Oh, probably a week into the trip. It was fatigue. I just didn't feel like doing anything. And then I got a tightness in the chest, lost my sense of taste, my sense of smell.
I told Bob, I said, I feel like I'm in the petri dish of the COVID.
Kelly Edge had been traveling with her husband, Woody. He'd been sick in bed for 5 days when everyone on board was ordered to quarantine in their cabins.
We are captive.
Captive.
You can't come in with a helicopter. We're in the middle of the ocean, and my husband's burning up.
Passengers began to call home, asking for help from members of Congress, reporters, and family.
There was conversations from people from the states that were contacting all government agencies. They had very sick family members on the ship, and they knew that they needed to get their family off ASAP.
The State Department got involved, and on day 13 of the cruise, passengers learned they would be allowed off the ship in Marseille. France had just started a nationwide lockdown. The Americans had to gather in this ship lounge to be checked by French medics before they were allowed to board buses for the airport.
This is where, in my opinion, it became criminal.
Criminal, she says, because the passengers, many in their 70s and showing symptoms of COVID, waited in the locked buses for 5 hours while paperwork was sorted out by U.S. diplomats. It was midnight when they finally got on the jet hired by the cruise line.
So, as you can hear, everybody's coughing.
This is Jenny Catron. She hoped the worst was behind them as she settled into seat 26D.
Here we go. We are hoping that when we get back to the United States, that these people will be able to get some medical help, finally.
The jet took off for Atlanta at 2 a.m. It wasn't lost on many that their destination, Atlanta, is the home of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The Atlanta airport is also one of 20 quarantine stations the CDC has around the country to screen ill travelers. Did you expect that when that plane landed in Atlanta, that you would be taken to quarantine?
100%.
While at sea, passengers saw news reports about COVID outbreaks on other cruise ships, including the Diamond Princess in Japan and the Grand Princess in California. In both cases, the CDC ordered hundreds of those passengers to quarantine at U.S. military bases. What was the scene on the plane like?
Someone described it as a flight from hell.
Did it feel like that?
Yes, I kept looking at the man and women to my left, coughing and coughing and coughing.
It became 9.5 hours of misery. The Andersons were in row 32. Kelly and Woody Edge were in the middle of the plane.
And then it happened. It was behind me about 10 rows, and a man started to collapse, and his wife was like, help, help, please help, we need a doctor.
Jenny Catron was several rows behind her. The experienced Red Cross volunteer who attended nursing school was already trying to help.
He was glowing. He had so much sweat. He was pale, palish green.
You didn't think, oh my gosh, this guy might have COVID right away?
I was pretty sure that at that point that we all had COVID.
Kelly Edge noticed Jenny was on her own and got up to help too.
And then, on the other side of me, to the right, and behind me about 2 rows, this man started going into some kind of respiratory distress. So I say to Jenny, I think you need to go for this man. What's going on here? And I can do this. And she said, just hold his hand, just reassure him. And all of a sudden, this man comes walking up. He's heading like he's going to the bathroom, and he just starts like a weeble wobble, and he just hits his head on the wall, and he falls to the ground.
So it's 1, 2, 3,
They're going
4.
they're going like fast now. We're laying them out
In the aisles?
in the like bulkheads,
Where are the flight attendants?
in the back. They just didn't know what to do either. They were very scared.
The captain comes out and we start discussing whether or not to divert the flight. We still had another 4 hours to Atlanta, and if we had landed in Bermuda, they could have still been sitting on the plane for another 6 hours where they debate whether or not they're going to let people into the hospitals there.
So the flight continued to Atlanta. But when the plane carrying the sick and exhausted passengers landed at 6:43 in the morning, the doors stayed closed.
And then we finally hear from the pilot that, apparently nobody knew we were coming. Nobody was prepared.
Does that make any sense
Nope.
based on the calls you guys are making from the ship? You guys are waving flags, calling the media.
The Atlanta News was there at the airport to meet us.
For them and Lori, I can't even imagine what it must have been like to be on that plane.
So where was the help? 60 Minutes spoke with the State Department, Customs and Border Protection, and the CDC on background. We were told the CDC knew the plane was coming, but didn't make plans to quarantine passengers. Instead, the decision was made to treat them like any other Americans returning from Europe in March by having them fill out a health questionnaire. But about an hour before the plane was to touch down, the CDC's plan blew up. Remember earlier when we told you about those French medics who screened the passengers in the ship lounge? It turns out the French tested 4 Americans for COVID, and 3 were positive and on the plane. That news surprised the CDC. They had to scramble together a team to go to the jet. Jenny Catron got sick of waiting.
And at that point, I just get on the phone and I call 911.
You called 911 from the plane?
Yes.
Atlanta Airport 911. My name is Jennifer Catron. I am on a plane. We just came over from France. I had 9 medical emergencies that I had to handle on this plane from France over to here. We're waiting for the CDC because we have possible coronavirus cases on board. I have people passing out.
3 more hours passed before the doors finally opened. Who are the first people to board the plane?
There were 2 or 3 different girls. They said that they were from the CDC. They were dressed in plastic. And they're like, okay, well, we need these 3 people that had tested positive in Marseille. So they get those 3 people off. And she goes, okay, now I need the people that have fevers and coughs. And the steward looks at him. She goes, honey, they're all sick.
The 3 positive passengers were taken to a hotel. Everybody else went to a cargo building where they were checked by the CDC for fever and filled out a short questionnaire. Nobody was given a COVID test, and some passengers told us they saw people with symptoms get through.
There were people, get this, their temperature was too high, so the CDC had them sit in chairs and wait and see if it got lower.
So I'm trying really hard not to second guess.
You're
And I
thinking
was
this
so-
is the CDC, they've got this.
That's what I'm trying to tell
And it's in their
myself.
hands now,
I'm trying to tell myself that.
but your mind is saying what?
You're not doing it right.
Passengers were then loaded onto buses for a short drive to baggage claim, and that was that. They were all free to go wherever they wanted.
Like half of it was the walking wounded. And I watched them all leave.
This plane comes in, people are sick, they're fainting, they're coughing, and then they're let into the main terminal of one of the busiest airports in America.
It was crazy.
Was it lost on anybody, or were you guys kind of looking at each other like, I can't believe they let us go?
Exactly. Those are the exact feelings we had. Utter surprise and bewilderment.
Some passengers removed their masks. Others hit the food court. Within hours, more than 200 of them, exposed to COVID or already sick with it, boarded commercial flights to 17 states and Canada, including the Andersons.
We felt guilty. We had our masks, we had our gloves, and we sat down, and the seat next to me was empty. And I said, please don't let anybody sit next to me.
Bob Anderson tested positive for COVID after he flew home to Utah. Kelly Edge's husband tested positive after he took a flight to Miami. 3 people on the plane were put on ventilators days later, and 2 other passengers who flew home, Tom Sheehan, who was in seat 24J, and Herman Boehm, who was in 10A, both died 9 days later. We wanted to know what the CDC was thinking, but they declined our request for an interview. We did obtain 160 pages of emails from the agency about the operation through the Freedom of Information Act, but all the sections about decision-making were redacted. How does this happen?
Undoubtedly, I would say this sort of constitutes public health malpractice, that you have individuals who are exposed, potentially multiple people infected within that group, and then you put them in the busiest airport in the world.
Dr. Ali Khan is the dean of the University of Nebraska School of Public Health. He is a former director of the CDC's Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response. Should any of those passengers been allowed to get on commercial flights at that point?
So those individuals definitely should have stayed in Atlanta and been appropriately isolated or quarantined based on their circumstances.
We knew enough at that point to know that was a bad decision.
Oh no, not only did we know enough at that point, we had already acted on that knowledge multiple times. We know that what was the right thing to do was with the Grand Princess and other cruise ships, that those individuals need to get off the ship, needed to be monitored separately in quarantine before they could go out and about their way.
The cruise line would not share the passenger list with us, but we were able to track down 64 of the Americans. And of those 64, 45 of them told us they tested positive for COVID soon after coming home.
This is what the agency plans for, day in and day out, on how to do this. I mean, this should have been second nature of how to make this happen.
The CDC alerted state health departments, but some passengers told us their states never followed up with them and didn't do any contact tracing. The lack of a unified response means nobody knows exactly how many passengers from that flight from hell brought home the coronavirus, or how many unsuspecting people they infected with COVID along the way.